but I haven't been able to find one technical paper in the whole literature that even looks at the topic. Some of you may know if there's some economists in the audience, but I can't find one, and no friends can find one. And it's not a minor phenomenon. It's 50% of U.S. FDI in the big emerging markets, big numbers. Well, make your own guesses. Anyhow, the whole system is so corrupt and rotten from the bottom that to talk about tactical changes is just beside the point. The current policies, exactly as you say, are to increase the military and biological warfare component of these policies abroad, and to continue the criminalization of the disposable people at home. Those are the current policies. Laurie Berenson is a very unfortunate victim of this. I should say the violence in Colombia, you want to take a look at it, it goes back very deep. It goes back to a socioeconomic system in which a tiny sector of the population has most of the wealth in a pretty wealthy country, and extraordinarily high poverty rates, starvation and so on. That's where the violence is coming from. Yeah?
Taking us back to Indonesia's, to an extent, to Indonesia's history. I find that very interesting. Current issues in Indonesia are the upcoming general election, the future of East Timor, and the disintegration that you mentioned earlier. Can you elaborate on that, sir? And also a couple of weeks ago, the IMF apologized to Indonesia on their mistakes, the approach of getting Indonesia out of the current crisis. Can you also comment on that?
I think it was the World Bank.
The World Bank.
Yeah. The World Bank published a report saying they'd made all sorts of mistakes. They were over-enthusiastic in their commitment to all these wonderful things that were happening in Indonesia, and being a little over-enthusiastic, they kind of played down the corruption and so on. That's not quite the story, but yeah, kind of interesting. The fact is that the World Bank and the IMF were praising Indonesia to the skies, along with Thailand, Malaysia, South Korea, for their solid economic fundamentals and the way they'd been following all the rules and all the magnificent things they've been doing. And to their dismay, the major publications appeared exactly as the whole system was crashing. It's not the first time that's happened, incidentally, but it was a pretty dramatic case. So they've been kind of running backwards ever since. And yes, they did say they'd made a lot of mistakes. That's mild. They knew what was going on and decided they liked it, because rich people in Indonesia were profiting and rich people abroad were profiting. So what's the fuss? No crisis. Now there's a crisis, so they're, looking back and so on, and they want to sort of reconstruct the situation, and they don't know how, because it may be that Indonesia will simply come apart. There's two issues that you raised. One is the disintegration, possible disintegration of Indonesia. The other is the specific case of East Timor. The East Timor case is difficult to figure out. I mean, Indonesia, let's take that one. Indonesia has agreed to grant what they call autonomy within the Indonesian, federation or something. Beyond that, there's a policy split, which may reflect two different tracks of Indonesian policy, or it may be two sides of the same cynical policy. Nobody knows. In fact, I suspect the people making the policy probably don't know. They're waiting to see how things turn out. One policy track would lead towards independence. The other policy track leads towards increasing violence. So while Indonesia is talking about, okay, you guys can be independent if you want, it's also at the same time organizing paramilitaries, arming them. They're carrying out violence. In fact, they're killing people, driving people out by the thousands, and the place is, exploding. The same, going back to the other question, is happening in Colombia. It's not an unusual pattern. A move towards peace negotiations and at the same time unleashing the paramilitaries with the military right in the background to tear the place apart. If there's going to be negotiations of some kind, you want to make sure that your thugs have it under control. Those two paths quite commonly go side by side. You find it elsewhere too. In this case, I think it's hard to say. I mean, it could be two sides of the same policy. It could be conflicting policies. It could be just uncertainty, that they don't know what's going to happen. I don't think there's much point speculating about this, frankly. As I said, I doubt that the Indonesian generals know. They're waiting to see what happens. What is significant here, as always, is that what we do about it can make a difference, a big difference. So one of the factors, and undoubtedly a major, if not decisive factor, will be how the United States responds to all of this. And that's the one factor we can do something about. So there's no point speculating about the others. You know, should ask what can we do about these. As for Indonesia breaking up, it could happen. There's a strong independence movement in Aceh. What they call Irian Jaya, West Papua, was given to Indonesia over the objections of its population. That has an independence movement. There's an independence movement in the Moluccas. It could go all sorts of ways. Don't forget, that whole thing was patched, like most of the world, that was just patched together by European imperialism. You know, they put it together for their reasons, not for the reasons of the countries. So if you sort of randomly broke up the United States and put them under different flags and so on and so forth, yeah, you'd have plenty of violence after a while. Because these breakdowns don't have anything to do with what's happening on the ground. You know, like for the Middle East, probably the only semi-rational structure that's been around in the last couple of thousand years was the Ottoman Empire, which allowed local autonomy to a large extent within a rather loose and corrupt and imperial framework. Okay, you know, people were freer under the Ottoman Empire than they've been since. They could go from one place to another, for example. But they had national treatment like General Electric wants. And that's probably right for most of the world. Actually, it's probably right for Europe, too. I mean, the borders in Europe are simply the result of hundreds of years of mutual massacre in the most violent and barbaric corner of the world, which is exactly what Europe was. For hundreds of years, the highest goal of Europeans was to slaughter one another. And the only reason that came to an end in 1945 is because they all understood that they had reached a level of violence such that the next time they tried, that's the end for everybody. That's why you have political scientists writing books on how there aren't wars among democratic societies and so on. Yeah, they know, they're smart enough to know that they try once more what they've been doing for the last 500 years and everybody's dead. So right now they're not fighting wars. But the borders that are left from these wars are pretty irrational. You know? And in fact, along with European unification, you're also finding devolution. So pressures towards regional autonomy, which probably makes a lot of sense, because the borders didn't make any sense. See, it's different in the United States. I mean, here it was easy. You just wipe out the indigenous population and settle it with a fairly homogeneous population. Okay, don't have big problems. But Europe didn't develop that way. And nor did the rest of the world. It was all imposed on them by, you know, by competing imperialisms. The Dutch East Indies are what the Dutch were able to hold on to. And what form it takes, you know, I don't think anybody can prescribe. It's for them to work out somehow, and not easy.
I agree with you that free trade has widened the gap between North and South.
I haven't said that. I don't think there is much free trade. In fact, a standard figure among international economists is that maybe 15% of world trade could be called free in some sense.
Net gains from free trade are being appropriated by
trade, not free trade.
Yeah, from trade are being appropriated by the North. Do you think that could be counterbalanced by freer movement of labor?
Oh yeah. In fact, if anybody believed in that, I mean, everybody's supposed to admire Adam Smith, but you're not supposed to read him. That's very crucial. If you read Adam Smith, you discover that one bad thing that you discover is that his argument for the market was based on the assumption that under conditions of liberty, a market will lead to equality, which is obviously a desideratum. So therefore, he argued markets are good. If it doesn't lead to equality, out. You also find out he was against division of labor and all sorts of other things you're not supposed to know. But one thing you're not supposed to know is that free trade is based on what he called free circulation of labor. Okay. Well, you know, he wasn't thinking so much about crossing borders in those days because nobody was even thinking of capital crossing border much in those days. But the principle is there. So surely you don't have anything like free trade unless you have free circulation of labor around the world. Otherwise, you know, you just don't have labor markets. I mean, we're not supposed to think about that along with a lot of other things, but yeah, that's true. Should you have free circulation of labor? Well, you know, that raises all kinds of questions. Questions about how people want to preserve their own communities, let's say. But then, of course, those very same questions show up with movement of capital. It's just you're not allowed to raise them in the case of movement of capital. Okay? So they're hard questions. You know, I don't think they have trivial answers. But you can't seriously talk about free trade unless you have free movement of people. That's one of the many reasons why the talk about free trade is mostly a fraud. It's an ideological weapon. It's not a descriptive fact. And there are many reasons, not just that one. Yeah, well, yeah.
I just wonder, what's your view, the reason for the Western U.S. involvement in Kosovo?
Kosovo is what's called a crisis, unlike, say, Angola. Kosovo, and it's bad. You know, it's not a joke. Like, there have been a lot of atrocities in Kosovo. Current estimates are that about 2,000 people were killed. It's about one night bombing by Jonas Savimbi. The reason Kosovo is a crisis and Angola, which is way worse, is not a crisis, is because Kosovo threatens the interests of rich and powerful people. I mean, Europe is disturbed by conflicts that are essentially within it, you know, and they don't want them to spread. For one thing, there'll be a big flow of refugees. And for another, you know, if that whole region starts to fall apart, you could end up with wars between Greece and Turkey and, you know, maybe a world war. Russia might get involved. So it matters. In Angola, it's just a lot of those guys killing each other. Who cares? Besides, it's not a nice one to talk about, since the main killer happens to be the person who was highly praised and lauded as a great freedom fighter in the United States back in the days of what was called constructive engagement, which was a nice name for supporting South African marauders who were tearing the place to shreds and killing, you know, over 1 million people. Well, one part of it was our freedom fighter in Angola, who's now still tearing the place apart. Not that the opposition is so great either. That's another story. Anyhow, it's a huge massacre that doesn't harm Europeans, at least as long as the resources flow out. And they are flowing out. So Savimbi's forces, UNITA, is being supported by mostly diamond flow, which is monopolized by a couple of companies. And they can trace the, technically there's an embargo against diamonds from Angola. And all the specialists in the field say that it's not hard to identify the diamonds that come from there. But what's the name of that company? De Beers, yeah. The De Beers company claims they can't do it. You know, only all the other experts can, but they can't. So there's a free flow of diamonds out of there to all sorts of, you know, Belgium, Israel, places like that. And that's supporting one side. And the other side, they got oil, which is going right to Western companies, so who cares? And meanwhile, they're killing each other or starving or whatever, but not bothering rich people. So it's not a crisis.
You talked about a lot of things here, and my question was, how do you go about keeping track of these things and learning of these things when you acknowledge that all of them aren't in the press and definitely aren't in our education? How would you suggest that?
Look, you can read the journals from Penang and Cairo the same way I do. I mean, it takes a lot of work, you know, but it can be done. And in fact, nowadays, for those of you who do use the internet, I don't, is a lot easier. But the real answer is nobody can do it alone unless they're crazy, you know. Because you have to be a fanatic. On the other hand, if people do it in common, it's not that hard. I mean, you travel through Midwest churches in the 1980s. And, I mean, I've done it. You know, you come to a church in, you know, Lawrence, Kansas, or someplace. They knew more about Central America than the CIA did. Way more. You know. because there was a lot of people and they cared about